Welcome back, and I'm with Professor Richard Calland, public law professor at UCT and also author of the book Make or Break. The next 3 years of South Africa will determine the next 3 decades. Now, Prof, to pick up where we left off, I'm imagining what's going to happen to small, newly formed parties, for instance. You know, we've got how many now that have registered to participate or to contest the elections? Over 400, I think. What would happen to them once the bigger players, collect much more money than the smaller ones? Will that deter them from registering in the future?
The rules of the game already and will continue to favour those that are already represented in Parliament, because the public funding regime only applies to those who have representation in Parliament. So the basic system is, if you can attract enough votes to get into Parliament, that will trigger public funding of your political party to help sustain it. And one of the important changes that this Act brings into effect, which should be mentioned, Tim, is this. Back in 1997, an unholy alliance between the ANC and the National Party agreed in Parliament that of the public funding cake, 90% would be allocated on the basis of proportional representation in Parliament. And at that time, the ANC and the National Party had over 80% of the seats in Parliament. And so they were going to get 90% of 80%. Sorry, 80% of, yes, 90% of 80%. The other 10% would be divided evenly across all other parties. Now, that formula, after years of argument by smaller parties in particular, and by NGOs, has now been changed under the new law. Now it will be 2/3, 1/3. Now, potentially, that 1/3 is a significant amount of money for a small party. That will be shared equally across all parties. So let's say it's 30 million rand, and there are 10 parties in Parliament. They will all get 3 million rand of that part of the cake. Now, for a new entrant to Parliament, that could be a real boost, I think. But you first got to win a seat in Parliament, and that takes getting at least 0.25% of the voting electorate, which is, in South Africa is about 50,000 voters.
Now, you mentioned something earlier about this being a global phenomenon where private interests could hijack the political program of a democracy, for instance. Are there instances that you can cite where private or even criminal interests, for that matter, took over a political party and then ran the government on behalf of its own interests?
Well, there are numerous cases from around the world. There's a famous case involving Total and Jacques Chirac, the then mayor, later president of France, where they effectively captured him, to use the language of state capture in South Africa, and compelled him to take a particular route in relation to policy. There are cases from Germany, there are cases from Australia. Mature democracies, this is my point, have also suffered from this phenomenon. As I said earlier in this program, it's very clear that with the arms deal, British Aerospace paid what for them was their usual bribe, according to Andrew Feinstein and other investigators, of around $10 million. And that mostly went into the pockets of the ANC and skewed the procurement process in favour of British Aerospace during that period of decision-making and that scandal in the late 90s. So, and bearing in mind what has happened with the Guptas and Bosasa and all of the other protagonists that are being exposed under the Zondo Commission and being revealed through the investigative journalist efforts in this country in the last couple of years, I think it's abundantly clear that a number of political parties, including the ANC, but especially the ANC, have benefited from the criminal intent of corrupt people trying to buy influence within the ANC.
Now, we're talking political parties here being captured when you cite the instance of the French President Jacques Chirac, for instance. But what about individuals then? Does the law say anything about the capturing or the funding of individuals who belong to influential political parties?
So, in short, what the law says is that you cannot make donations to individuals as a loophole, as a way around the regime. the new transparency governance regime. So that's not a loophole. A donation to an individual member of a political party will have the same effect in terms of triggering the rules for disclosure as to the party itself. One of the most contentious areas of debate during the legislative route journey of this law was whether foreign donations should be allowed. And the compromise that was reached was that there shouldn't be direct foreign donations to political party, that foreign entities could, however, fund the capacity building efforts of political parties. One of the things we've been arguing for many years is that parties should spend their money not just on campaign posters and T-shirts and all of that, but they should actually be developing policy institutes, they should be developing skills, they should be developing their human capital between elections so that they are more effective think tanks, so that they can develop their role in public policy. The Dutch is a very important model here. Their public funding of Dutch political parties is directed not just at electioneering and campaigning, but also very particularly to developing that institutional capacity for political parties. I think taxpayers are probably pretty tired of funding campaign posters and T-shirts. I think they would probably, speaking myself as a taxpayer, would be happier if at least some of that money was going into building up the thinking capacity of political parties as well as its electioneering capacity.
But let me hear your views here, Prof, that we are beginning to hear a lot of stuff coming from the commissions that you mentioned, the State Capture Commission in particular on Bosasa, for instance, and thanks to investigative journalists and some political parties, we also got to know about the Gupta shenanigans. But we've got so many corruption and crime combating institutions in South Africa, and some that are geared towards protecting our democracy. Why was it difficult, or has it been difficult, for these institutions to detect that something was going wrong in the system?
That's an excellent question, Tim. It's the sort of $6 million question. And of course, part of the answer to that question is that some of those institutions, such as the National Prosecuting Authority, or even the South African Revenue Service, had themselves been captured. That as they got too close to the money, as their own investigations got perilously close to the architects and the beneficiaries of the corrupt state capture project, so what the state capture project leaders did was to put their men into those agencies to denude them of their teeth, to remove their investigating capacity. That's what happened with Tom Mayani at the South African Revenue Service. That's what the Nugent Commission of Inquiry found. So what we're sitting through now, Tim, and it's an extraordinary catalogue of revelation and disclosure, is it not, is an extraordinary period of, I hope, reform and remedial action. As we all know, before you can remedy something, you have to understand it. You have to diagnose before you prescribe. What all of this plethora of commissions of inquiry are doing is revealing the rot, and they're getting to the root causes of what happened. What must then happen is, first of all, recommendations for remedial action must be taken seriously and acted upon. And secondly, the prosecutorial authorities must do their job. And they should be already doing their job. They should be investigating each and every one of these allegations to discover if there was criminal activity, and then they should prosecute.
When you wrote the book Make or Break 3 years ago, did you anticipate that things would have changed in this manner in South Africa? I mean, then President Jacob Zuma was still in charge, and he's been removed. Now we've got this plethora of the commissions, as you say, and that are revealing the shenanigans that have been going on within the politics and government in South Africa. So when you take a look back to then, what do you think?
Well, Tim, thank you for asking me about the book. It was suggesting, as the subtitle of the book says, that the 3-year period from the local government elections in August 2016 through to the national election, which is likely to be in May this year, 2019 that a series of major things would happen during that 3-year period of history, which would set the course for the next 30 years. Now, I posed 6 big questions to discover what the trajectory might be. One of them, to take an example, was who would succeed Jacob Zuma as president of the ANC. We now know the answer to that. It was a crucial moment when the ANC chose to elect a reformer, somebody in President Ramaphosa who is willing to acknowledge that things had gone wrong, who's willing to give political support to reform efforts and to rebuild those institutions that have been diminished and denuded of their integrity. Another issue was, would Pravin Gordhan succeed and prosper, or would he face the chop? Well, both things happened, strangely. It was a complex story. Initially he survived, then he was chopped by Zuma, and then of course once Ramaphosa won, he was restored to the cabinet and is now doing an extraordinarily important job at state-owned enterprises, rebuilding the governance and the management capability of those important development institutions that government essentially owns.
But now we are living in the era of corruption as the main topic, and of course the commissions of inquiry are revealing the rot that has been taking place there. But this might affect the ANC negatively, don't you think, in the forthcoming elections? And on the basis of that, how do you project the next 3 decades for South Africa, you know, given the rebuilding that must take place, given the fact that the economy will have to be grown, given that we've got socio-economic challenges with high unemployment rate and poverty levels that are very, very high? What do you think is likely to happen, you know, when you cast your eyes to the May election and the dynamics and the context that we are in now?
So that's such an interesting question, because I'm by instinct an optimistic person, and so I look at the last 2 or 3 years in an optimistic fashion, because what I see is that the state capture project was, if not defeated, at least brought to a halt, that reformers took power, that the rule of law held, that the judiciary held the line, and that the Constitution prevailed. It was stress tested by Jacob Zuma and his cronies, and that was the one upside of the Zuma years. But the Constitution, we now know, is more than a piece of paper. It can protect people's rights, it can protect democracy from corrupt people who want to steal it. That's the short point. In the longer term, that positive story will only be a positive story in the longer term if, and this was the last question I posed in my book, will the centre hold? Will the socio-economic transformation that this country needs in terms of creating jobs, in terms of building a new social compact, in terms of closing the painful inequality gap, if it doesn't tackle those issues, then this country remains, I fear, both perilously close to upheaval, but also ripe for the sort of populism that we've seen in many countries around the world. And of course we have our own populist demagogue here in the form of Julius Malema. One of the things that this election in mid-year will tell us is whether South Africa has an appetite for that form of crude populism and demagoguery, or whether it's willing to back a reforming president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Whether we like the ANC or not, and whether we blame them for the Zuma years or not, I think the political hard reality is that this country needs Ramaphosa to succeed, and that in turn means that he needs a strong majority. The ANC needs to win a strong majority in mid-year to give him that mandate to continue this reform process and to ensure that the Zuma faction is properly vanquished.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Richard Calland. Enjoyed talking to you and appreciated your time. Thank you. He's the author of the book,
Thank you very much,
Make or Break. The next 3 years will determine South Africa's future over the next 3 decades. After the break, we turn our focus to local government and service delivery with Dr. Makosi Koza. Don't go away.